The principles of modality and redundancy applied to e-learning. After viewing this presentation, the viewer will understand the principles of modality and redundancy and be able to identify examples that effectively use these principles. The modality principle suggests that whenever instruction can be presented using graphics and audio rather than graphics with printed text, greater learning will result. The reasoning is that learners may experience an overload of their visual channel when they have to look at both text and graphics at the same time. We can reduce the visual load by using narration rather than printed text. By doing this, the visual channel attends to the graphics, while the auditory attends to the narrated words. This creates a balance of the content between the two channels and provides for a more effective learning. Now let's move on to the redundancy principle. This principle is when a presentation uses graphics, text, and narration. Now we have the narration entering the audio channel, but we still have an overloaded visual channel taking in the text and graphics. Another problem that arises is that the learner will spend time comparing the spoken words against the printed words, which again takes away from the graphics. This is referred to as extraneous cognitive processing. Does this mean that we should never use the three forms of media at the same time? No, there are actually exceptions in e-learning when using redundant on-screen text will actually help support the learning process. It is referred to as the redundancy principle 2. Let's look at some of those exceptions. Exception 1. Redundant text may be considered appropriate and not overload the viewer when there is no pictorial presentation on the screen. This slide is an example. There are no animations, videos, photos, graphics, or illustrations of any sort. Exception 2 states that redundant text may be considered appropriate and not overload the viewer when there is plenty of time to process the graphics. This means the graphics and text are presented sequentially, or the presentation moves slow enough to process both. Exception 3 is when content requires greater cognitive effort to comprehend the text. For example, the verbal material might be long and complex or require special formulas or steps in a procedure that are needed to help support the learner. The material might also present vocabulary that is technical, unfamiliar, or that are keywords to remember. Another reason for including redundant on-screen text may be to give support to students with learning disabilities. A final example would be in a situation where the student is a second language learner and the text support is needed. Now that we've discussed these principles, let's see if we can recognize some of them. I'm going to show you some samples of e-learning presentations. You decide whether it is an example of modality, redundancy, or redundancy 2. Here is your first example. This presentation is to teach middle school children long division. It is narrated and animated and describes the steps to work through a problem. Does this video follow the modality, redundancy, or redundancy 2 principle? If you said redundancy principle 2, you are correct. You will notice that the 4 steps are on the screen and they're there to lend support to the learner because they are keywords to help solve the problem. This next example teaches the color wheel. It is a narrated presentation and reads the text to the student. Which of the principles best describes this presentation? Modality, redundancy, or redundancy 2? If you said redundancy, you are correct. The learner would have the tendency to follow along the narrator as he read and at the same time try to focus on the graphics. It would cause a visual overload as well as extraneous cognitive processing on the learner. This example is a presentation on equipment needed for backpacking. Each of the pictures are highlighted and described with narration. Which principle does this example best illustrate? Modality, redundancy, or redundancy 2? If you said modality, you are correct. The e-learner would receive the content balanced between their visual and audio channels. This concludes our lesson on the principles of modality and redundancy as they pertain to e-learning. Hopefully you have learned some important tips for preparing e-learning presentations.